Mishmash! Kitbash Corner!
Hey, today I'm doing a very special Chaos Space Marine kit bash. A friend of mine decided to kinda dip his toes into 40k, and casually came up with one of the coolest Chaos Space Marine designs I ever done see with my one eyeball. And after being left with a ton of inspiration, I decided to kit bash some heavily Grimdark Heretic Astartes today. This is definitely a lot more elaborate than my usual Chaos Space Marine kit bashes. We'll be using green stuff and some absolutely metal techniques. I mean, literally, I'm using some wire and I poke myself. Though I'm kit bashing these figures to almost one-to-one emulate his design, I guarantee you can use these methods on your own figures. But before we get into all that good stuff, make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with a friend, and if you really dig it, consider becoming a channel member. For just $3 a month, you get to see my videos early, and for $5, you get access to a weekly Q&A stream in which I'll showcase your models. You also get exclusive roles and channels within the Mishmash Discord, and we'll also have a monthly hobby meetup. Just want to say a huge thank you to my channel members. You guys are amazing. But even further, I must ask you, are you a Tabletop Stronghold? Yeah, baby, this video is sponsored by Tabletop Stronghold, one of the very best miniature carrying case companies on the whole wide world. As a hobbyist of over 10 years, I have to say that the mag case is by far the safest case I've ever stored my minis in. And it better takes advantage of every square inch, allowing me to store more of my miniatures. And if cases aren't your style, there's also some amazing MDF terrain you can get from Tabletop Stronghold as well. But the good things don't stop there. The Black Friday sale is up and you can get up to 40% off your purchase. Now that's a deal. Huge thank you to Tabletop Stronghold for sponsoring this video. But enough of the promotional stuff. I want to talk briefly about the Warband. The Void Phantoms are a renegade Chaos Space Marine warband. Their forces are scattered in small isolated clusters along the galaxy's outermost reaches. The Phantoms are the living embodiment of scorn, harbingers who seek nothing less than the reduction of all existence to cold, silent cinder. Their weaponry is as nightmarish as their intent, warp-tainted flamers of which belch dark obsidian fire, each plume resembling the very absence of light. As for the Astartes themselves, communication amongst them is unheard of. Instead, they pronounce only metallic grinding gurgles, a hideous echo of what they once were. However, despite bearing a closer likeness to an automaton than a living being, a single fragment of their lost humanity lingers: their laughter. Deep, booming, and sickeningly gleeful. This grotesque mockery is said to be the only noise capable of piercing the agonized screams of those consumed by the void flame, immolated in fire that devours light and hope alike, all in the name of malice. So yeah, these are the Void Phantoms, a fun little project I made alongside my friend. He wrote a little bit of lore, I spruced it up, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And this is essentially what we're going to try to be kit bashing today. But you don't have to kit bash this to be Void Phantoms, obviously. Use it as inspiration. In fact, let's get to the kit bashing. Now, to begin the process of kit bashing our first Marine, I would take one of the torso pieces from the new Mark II Space Marines from the Horus Heresy line. Very blatantly, I'm slicing off the butt plate and I'm carving out the underside so it might gently fit onto a regular Chaos Space Marine leg piece. The flatter the surface, the better, so I ended up picking this leg piece in particular because it'll adhere nicely, and I just really like chainmail. Before gluing anything, I decided to dryly fit each piece of the torso onto the legs. However, I did end up having to slice down the cod piece in order for this to fit nicely. This is more so on the underside, so it fits right along the loincloth. And once we fit the pieces together, it's quite a nice fit all things considered. However, there is a little bit of kibble on the bottom side, and if you haven't noticed, there's a lack of covering on the ass, hence why I kept around the butt plate. It fits a little awkwardly, admittedly, but once it was in place with a little bit of Tamiya, it melded to the plastic of the underside quite well. However, it does look like he has a dump truck ass, but that's, I don't know, maybe some people like that. Once the main torso is configured to the legs, I already have a really nice thing going for me. This piece is rather befitting considering most Chaos Space Marines already have armor from the Heresy era, and instead of an agonizing plethora of Chaos trim, I just have a nice simple ring. But with the main body built up, I then decided to begin building his weapon, and for this I'm using one of the flamers from the Mark IV Heresy kit. This is so I can simply slice away at the hand, and kind of build away as I please. However, this weapon turned out to be an absolute homunculus. There is a lot of weird kit bashing, and at first it seemed rather simple. I just glued it onto one of the Heresy pattern arms from the tank kit, or I guess the Rhino kit, but it didn't quite fit into place the way I wanted to. This is where we have to take a quick little break to slice away at the holster. I hate to do it, I think this is a cool looking bit, but it's in the way of progress. And I want to fit this Marine to look almost exactly like the original depiction. With the holster sliced away, it fits rather perfectly. A left-handed flamer, or I guess a left-handed weapon in general, is not something we see too often, but it would be nice to have. However, I wasn't finished using the pieces from the Rhino driver, or I guess the gunner. The soft blade hand is kind of perfect for the original design. There's a little bit of swagger to it, and it's something that I'd like to see a little bit more often with Space Marine kits. And I would say that things are looking pretty perfect here, but no, I can't be satisfied with this. This is too simple. Yeah, I ended up slicing off almost the entire half of the flamer. This is so I can do some SID tier operations on the gun. Recently, I've been inspired by my buddy Lich, go check out his Bad Ab War video by the way, and I ended up picking up a nice little pack of polystyrene tubes. This would fit as the main barrel of the flamer, and yes, it looks horrible right now because I'm completely decimating this thing and trying to glue it on. But after a ton of fiddling, it would eventually look a little bit more presentable, but there's a lot of work to be done. Once it finally fit onto the gun, I would then add on the original bits from the flamer, this being the muzzle as well as the undergrip. However, this too would be something that I'd have to take off in order to do exactly what I wanted to do. I know this is frustrating to watch, trust me. I probably should have planned this out a little bit better and I did kind of improvise, but by this point that's just kind of how I function. However, in my defense, by this point I do think it is starting to formulate what the original design looked like, and I would try to add on some more wires by using actual wire. However, this proved to be a little bit too robust, and clipping these small pieces was a little too fiddly for my taste. Thankfully, I had even thinner polystyrene to work with, and I would add in some wires and some connecting tubing for the fuel. This was a fiddly process, but thankfully I used enough mind power to simply just use some tweezers. Once a bunch of these little bits were in place, I will be adding in more later on, I decided to drill into the barrel to create some vents. The original design is far too intricate for me to do, so I ended up doing these rather large ones, which are a little unsightly, but I'm going to make it work. My goal is to make it look as if these flames are so corrosive that they melt the weapons themselves over time. Not really that shocking, but these are Astartes weapons. I will say this process is a little scary because the original pipe I ended up using was hollow, so this was a very delicate and brittle operation. I ended up sealing these off using a little bit of thin Tamiya, which did melt some areas in ways that were undesirable, but again, I just kind of made lemonade out of lemons, and it'll be easier to see once I actually apply paint to these guys. You also might notice I ended up using yet another thin piece of the polystyrene just to add in more detail. It also kind of beefs up the weapon a little bit more, and I'm just a huge fan of ragtag Chaos Space Marines as well as just Renegade Marines to begin with, so this look is more than ideal. However, to kind of go in with the pseudo-mortifactors look, I then added an orc skull to the top of the flamer, and I would use his jawbone on the muzzle of the flamer as well. This detail in particular was way too cool to pass up, so I ended up having to use an orc skull rather than a human skull for it to fit, but I still think it looks cool. I also ended up using some of the wire I opted out of using earlier as a way of connecting the skull to the flamer a little bit more. Why is this thing here? I don't really know, but it looks cool. But with that last piece in place, I'm calling the flamer finished and I can turn my attention back onto the main Marine. I then decided to add on one of the pauldrons from the base Chaos set, this being this highly spiky pauldron. I probably shouldn't have wasted this pauldron because it will be covered up with green stuff and the effect I ended up trying didn't work as well, but it's not the end of the world. For the right side, I ended up using the skull pauldron, and I would drill into the eye sockets, and I would actually end up drilling on the underside of the pauldron, so I could create a third hole that completely bullseyes through the Chaos Star atop the skull's forehead. Once the holes were dremeled in, I would then slice off bits from my wire, creating these very jagged spikes. This was to create another piece from the original art. However, it's not up to exactly what I wanted it to be, but I can always just kitbash more of these guys. One slight side note may not surprise you, it made picking up this figure very difficult. I lost count of how many times I poked my fingers. Never drew blood though. But with these horrifying details complete, I then decided to do something that looks terrible right now, but it turned out pretty cool in the end. I decided to use some green stuff to create the cloak, and if it's not abundantly clear, I applied this way too quickly. I should have waited a little bit longer, and it is definitely very liquidy in this state. I will say, it does look cool in the end, so just trust the process. At this point, I ended up picking out his melon too, this being one of the Noise Marine helmets that I actually used in a previous episode. I like this one too much to not reuse it. I know that's kind of blasphemy, and I do feel bad for just ripping it off an old Marine, but it works out and I think it looks cool. It's mostly the eyes. The eyes are just perfect and it looks pretty similar to the original design. While the helmet glued on, however, I ended up taking my knife and cutting out little details for the green stuff, slowly kind of assembling it and taking away parts I don't like. But I then decided to focus my efforts onto the power pack. At this point, I kind of ripped off parts of the green stuff, and I decided that the power pack was the go. First thing I ended up doing was taking one of the Mark IIs, and I decided to glue on this bit from the Noise Marine kit, this being the muzzle to the actual gun. This is pretty similar to the design that was made, however, it's not as gruesome as I want it to be, so I'll be adding in green stuff later on to kind of cover up the eyes. However, for the vents, I decided to use more of my orc jawbones. These fit perfectly around the vents, however, I did decide to use human skulls this time around, just to differentiate things. Plus, I do think it would look a little weird for a Chaos Marine to have a bunch of Xeno skulls. However, it does sound cool. But human skulls were the go, and I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. There's something really grotesque about it too. Having several different skulls from different species makes them even more threatening. Once they were in place, I'd add in the green stuff to add in a little bit of padding on the main power pack, and I would Dremel the eye sockets of the skulls and fit in more spikes. I think the Grimdark look is starting to really set in for this guy. However, I did end up tearing apart at the cloak off screen, and I would simply assemble it in different pieces to create a better look overall. This is much more convincing, and even though it's not the best that it could be, I still like how it looks. Also, to fit the little pendant on the pauldron, I actually just sliced off a little bit from the Chaos Space Marine motorbikes, and I would flatten it out. That gives me a nice little place to add on some freehand. But with those final details made, I actually added in more detail off screen. I decided to give him a Wargames Atlantic zombie on the top of the power pack. But with that final detail, I am incredibly happy with how this guy turned out. And we gotta give major kudos to Cine for the drawing. He is slowly learning the lore, but he's pretty brand new to the setting. So to casually draw something that amazing to begin with in the span of about 15 minutes, and have it fit into the setting so neatly, that is insanely impressive. And I really enjoyed running along with the design to create something truly creepy and grimdark. With very rare exception, I like my Chaos Space Marines as edgy as possible and creepy. And we did just that with this figure in particular. This might not be your cup of tea when it comes to kit bashing, however the second figure will be a little less pointy. Speaking of which, let's get to that. Now, because I was essentially trying to recreate the original art piece of the first figure, I decided the second figure would be kind of a challenge on myself. I simply wanted to create another Marine that utilized the original design philosophy my friend made. To continue off of the design that I kind of had to work with the first guy, I ended up using yet another body from the Mark IIs. However, this was not as clean a fit as the first guy, so I ended up having to slice off the belt buckle and the skull from the front part of the body. It's not nearly as clean a look either. It's pretty ugly, but I decided to wrap around a belt made of green stuff. But we'll get to that in just a moment. First, we gotta kit bash the Flamer, and truth be told, this is actually the original one that I wanted to use for the first guy. The Flamer bit I ended up using was from the vintage Chaos Space Marines kit. This is when they still had the handles attached to the weapons, And though this might seem a little sacrilegious, I have like a million of these because I never really used flamers back in the day. After slicing away at the barrel and the fuel canister, I would then attach on a bit from the Cawdor Gang Redemptionists, this being a leftover part that I had from my Chaos Cultist Kitbash. This is a rather long flamer and it has a chain axe attached to it. There's already a fuel canister attached to the top portion, and I love just how rickety the actual chains look. I can only imagine it's all the more agonizing to be torn apart by this. Once I was happy with how it looked overall, I would then attach it to one of the arms from the Horus Heresy line, and I would put this on the body. Here you can see I very diligently wrapped around the Space Marine's torso, just to cover up that little bald spot. I'd also attached a very skull-filled pauldron to the right side, and I kinda played around with different headpieces for what I wanted to go with for this guy. Keeping in line with the creepy eyes was definitely the goal, and I was bouncing around with some Night Lords bits, but I came up with a different piece later on. Now for the left arm, I couldn't really find something that fit too well, so I ended up just fitting on one of the knife arms from the base Chaos Marines kit. But I will say one advantage this second guy has is I really did plan ahead with the green stuff. This time I attached the cape onto the headpiece over the main arm, and then I would attach the pauldron, kind of giving myself a little bit more room to paint the actual trim of the pauldron rather than just completely covering it up. I did add an additional bit of green stuff onto the back portion of the neck of the headpiece, however this does not completely cover over the pauldron, something that I do think looks a little bit better than the first go around. I also allowed the green stuff to dry a lot longer rather than just simply using it around 20 minutes after I sealed it together. I then fit on one of my favorite helmets of all time from the Chaos Space Marines kit. I need more of these. Even though I got a brand new box, I still don't have enough of these. I just think it's a universal headpiece, it fits just about everything. And I didn't even really need to glue it on, the green stuff holds it in place. After doing so, I would turn my attention back to the left pauldron, and I would drill in the eyes and fit in more spikes. This guy is definitely less pointy like I mentioned, but I do want to keep this design philosophy in mind. I'm almost tempted to Dremel in the eyes of the Space Marine and then add the little spikes. Maybe. Now for his power pack. I decided to use one of the old Khorne Berserker power packs, and I would snip off the exhaust vents. This was so I could add on some newer ones with the newer Chaos Space Marines kit, this being the Chaos Champion skulls. It would have been kind of fun to fit on natural skulls, but I think this look works really well. As a final little touch-up, I feathered out the green stuff cape a little bit more, and I thought it would be cool to mount some accompanying skulls on each of his shoulders, naturally both impaled upon the armor itself. Definitely much less detailed than the first guy and not nearly as elaborate, but for something that didn't have nearly as much inspiration, I was pretty happy with how he turned out. Might not be as downright terrifying as his brother, but he still holds his own. And I really do want to build an entire kill team of these guys. But like I said, didn't paint any of these figures, so I'll remind you again, let me know how you want these guys to look. We're trying to come up with a color scheme, but we're not quite sure yet. So suggestions are more than welcome. I can guarantee you we will go with something absolutely grimdark. A lot of streaking grime. And I gotta say, it's been pretty fun to come up with these guys on the fly. There's definitely a lot more lore that I want to come up with, and maybe we'll sprinkle in more videos like this to kind of fill it out. But I really do want to get back into homebrewing. But hey, I'm definitely flapping my beak enough for one video, so like always, if you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.